Berlin, November 1923. A woman walks into a grocery shop carrying a handbag full of paper marks. She leaves with less food than she bought the day before. Prices have moved again. They always move now. A few streets away, a man with almost no paper currency signs over a handful of gold-backed claims and quietly acquires a warehouse. Same city, same collapse. Two completely different outcomes. One person is still inside the currency, the other has already stepped outside it. That is the part history almost never explains cleanly. Collapses do not begin when the public panics. They begin earlier, in a quieter place, when the people closest to capital, credit, and risk stop trusting the system's promises. Long before the headlines turn dramatic, before the cues form, before the speeches begin, wealth starts to move. Not randomly, not emotionally, structurally. And it moves into the same places again and again. This is not a story about fear or prediction. It is not a list built for entertainment. It is a pattern that appears across currencies, empires, banking systems, and political regimes. The names change, the policies change, the explanations change, but the behavior of serious money does not. Before every major collapse, wealth migrates into assets that perform 5 specific functions. They hold value outside the local currency. They remain tied to real demand. They reduce exposure to domestic institutions. They preserve liquidity when access begins to tighten. And they maintain the ability to act when others are forced to react. That is the hidden structure. The wealthy do not survive collapse because they are braver. They survive because they stop holding the same kinds of promises everyone else is told to trust. Part 1. Money without an issuer. Gold is always the first move, and it is often misunderstood. It is not because gold always rises. It does not. It is not because gold is perfect. It isn't. Gold matters for a more structural reason. When trust in institutions begins to weaken, capital moves toward assets that do not depend on institutional credibility to exist. Gold does not rely on a bank's solvency. It does not require a government to defend it. It does not need policy consistency or central bank discipline. It exists outside the promise layer entirely. Across centuries of financial crises, this behavior repeats. When the credibility of money itself is questioned, investors begin shifting toward assets with no issuer. Not because they are flawless, but because they remove counterparty risk from the equation. Even now, the signal remains visible. In 2024, central banks purchased over 1,000 metric tons of gold for the 3rd consecutive year. That is not retail panic. That is institutional behavior. It reveals something uncomfortable. Even the institutions that manage the system do not want to rely entirely on it. In collapse conditions, this distinction becomes critical. Money can still exist technically while failing functionally. It can circulate, be counted, and be reported while losing its ability to store value over time. And wealth is stored time. Gold continues to appear in these moments because it allows that time to exist outside a weakening monetary system. But gold solves only one problem. It protects against monetary failure. Collapse is rarely only monetary. Part 2. Wealth tied to necessity. When systems begin to strain, capital moves toward assets connected to physical demand. This is where productive land enters the pattern. Not speculative property, not status real estate. Productive land. Land tied to food, water, shelter, or output. The reason is simple. When economies weaken, discretionary demand collapses first. Necessary demand does not. Food consumption does not disappear in a recession. It becomes more important. That is why farmland has historically behaved differently from financial assets. Over long periods, it has delivered stable returns with significantly lower volatility, while maintaining strong correlation with inflation during stress periods. But the deeper reason is not statistical. It is structural. Productive land anchors wealth to output instead of valuation. It converts capital into something that continues to function even when pricing systems become unstable. This pattern appears repeatedly across regions. In Argentina, during repeated currency crises, families with access to land, exports, or real production maintained far greater resilience than those holding purely financial claims inside the local system. The principle is consistent. When abstraction fails, output dominates. But land has a limitation. It is fixed. It is slow. It cannot move. And collapse often becomes a race against restriction. Part 3. Liquidity outside the system. Before a currency crisis becomes visible to the public, it becomes visible to those managing large flows of capital. They see stress in funding markets. They see changes in borrowing costs. They see gaps between official narratives and market reality, and they respond in a predictable way. They move liquidity into a different unit: dollars, Swiss francs, external accounts. The purpose is not return, it is optionality. When the domestic currency becomes unstable, liquidity inside that currency is no longer true liquidity, it is exposure. This is why wealthy individuals and institutions begin diversifying currency holdings long before crisis becomes obvious. Recent data shows rising demand among high net worth individuals for foreign accounts, particularly in stable jurisdictions. The pattern is old. During historical banking panics, once confidence in convertibility weakened, depositors shifted toward forms of money they believed would hold value across borders and systems. The mechanism is simple. When trust in one monetary system declines, capital seeks another. But currency is only part of the equation, because collapse is not just financial, it is political. Part 4. Wealth with legal distance. This is where the pattern becomes less visible. The wealthy do not only change what they own, they change where and under whose law they own it. Offshore structures, foreign accounts, multi-jurisdictional holdings, these are not recent inventions. They are structural responses to regime risk. The scale is significant. Trillions of dollars are held in foreign accounts, with a disproportionate concentration among the highest wealth brackets. This is not accidental behavior. It reflects a specific concern. In crisis conditions, governments do not remain neutral. They impose controls, adjust rules, and, when necessary, redirect private capital toward public stabilization. Capital controls, forced conversions, taxation changes, reporting requirements, these are recurring features of financial stress. Offshore positioning creates distance from those risks. It is not about secrecy alone, it is about jurisdiction. The key question is not just what you own, it is where that ownership is enforced. But even this does not complete the system, because preserving wealth is only half the strategy. Part 5. The power to acquire during collapse. This is where the pattern shifts from defense to offense. The final asset is not a commodity or a currency. It is ownership in essential cash flow businesses. Collapse does not eliminate demand, it reshapes it. During the Great Depression, while unemployment surged and output collapsed, certain businesses expanded. Companies tied to necessity, efficiency, or structural demand gained market share while weaker competitors failed. This reveals a deeper truth. Wealth does not survive collapse by hiding. It survives by repositioning into assets that continue generating income and can acquire undervalued assets during forced selling. Cash flow creates optionality. Optionality creates power, and power determines who buys the future when others are selling it. Step back and look at the full structure. Each asset corresponds to a specific failure mode. Gold protects against monetary trust failure. Productive land protects against necessity breakdown. Foreign currency protects against local monetary instability. Offshore structures protect against jurisdictional risk. Cash flow businesses protect against economic contraction while enabling expansion. This is not a random list, it is a system, and it explains something deeper about how different groups experience collapse. Most people are taught to optimize for return. Wealthy individuals optimize for survivability, jurisdiction, and optionality. That difference is invisible in stable periods. It becomes decisive in unstable ones. Collapse is not just an economic event. It is a sorting mechanism. It separates those whose wealth depends entirely on institutional continuity from those whose wealth can function without it. By the time the majority recognizes collapse, the minority has already adapted to it. The first phase is quiet reallocation. The second is patient acquisition. This is why collapse often feels sudden. The signals were always there. They just appeared in behavior, not headlines. Capital moving quietly. Assets shifting categories. Jurisdictions changing. Risk being priced differently by those closest to it. The real warning sign is not panic. It is repositioning. When those with the most to lose begin reducing their dependence on the system, they are not reacting to collapse. They are anticipating it. Because collapse, at its core, is not when prices fall. It is when trust, liquidity, and institutional reliability begin to fracture at the same time. And in that environment, different rules apply. The middle class is usually the most exposed. It holds financial claims, but lacks the flexibility to reposition them early. It depends on systems that may not fail completely, but do not need to fail completely to cause damage. The wealthy understand this. That is why they diversify not just across assets, but across systems, across currencies, across jurisdictions, across sources of income, across legal frameworks. They are not predicting collapse with precision. They are reducing exposure to its consequences. And that is the pattern history keeps repeating. Before every collapse, serious money does not wait for confirmation. It migrates toward assets that do not depend on the promises that are beginning to weaken. Gold, productive land, foreign liquidity, offshore protection, and cash flow businesses positioned to acquire during distress. 5 assets, 5 functions, 1 recurring structure. The real lesson is not timing, it is recognition. By the time collapse is obvious, the repositioning is already complete. And those who moved early are no longer asking whether the system will hold, they are deciding what to buy when it doesn't. If this changed how you see it, subscribe. This channel studies collapse patterns so you recognize them before you are forced to live through them.